to celebrate Frederick Douglass, his journey to Ireland. And, you know, this whole week has been so inspirational, so creative, so insightful. We've seen so many great talks and conversations, and I know that this one will be another one of those. And as a scholar of film and visual arts myself, I'm especially excited to introduce this event with Dr. Sweeney and Professor John Stauffer. But before we start, just a few last things of housekeeping before we go ahead and start this wonderful event. There is a Q&A box in the bottom, on the bottom of your little screen. You can pop in your question there whenever you're ready. If you have a question, you pop it in there. Kristen and I will be monitoring it and passing it on to Fionnghuala and John. Also, this is live. We're live on YouTube, so hello to everyone on YouTube. But we'll also record it, and it will be available on our YouTube channel, hashtag Douglas Week. So that will be available there soon. And now it's my great pleasure to introduce you guys to Dr. Fionnghuala Sweeney from Newcastle University. Fionnghuala is an amazing scholar and woman, and I am so honored to introduce her. Fionnghuala's work encompasses so many phenomenal projects, but just a few examples of her research. She has published widely about the career, the writing, the activism of Frederick Douglass. She's published on the Black Atlantic, Douglass's relationship with Ireland and Haiti and Egypt, and she's written about emancipation and Irish anti-slavery writing, the Cuban slave narrative, and so much more. And currently, I hear that Fionnghuala is working on completing a book on Moses Roper, the anti-slavery campaigner, writer, and fugitive slave. So looking forward to that, Fionnghuala, and the stage is yours. Thank you so much for guiding us through the evening.
I think I may have been muted. Thank you very much, Caroline, for that introduction. And it's a really great pleasure to be here for Douglas Week. And it's as great a pleasure to introduce and to host John Stauffer's talk this evening. John is the inaugural Cates Professor of English and of African American Studies at Harvard University. He's the author or editor of 20 books and over 100 articles, including Giants, The Parallel Lives of Frederick Douglass and Abraham Lincoln, which is, as we might expect, a national bestseller. The award-winning Black Hearts of Men, Battle Hymns of the Republic, and perhaps most importantly, as far as this evening's conversation is concerned, Picturing Frederick Douglass. His essays and reviews have appeared in Time, in the Wall Street Journal, in the New York Times, the Washington Post, and in exhibition catalogues, journals, and books. He's also presented on national radio and TV. He has served as a consultant or co-curator on films, on exhibitions, and video games, including God in America, Django Unchained, War Photography, The Free State of Jones, The Abolitionists, Picturing Frederick Douglass, Red Dead Redemption 2, and Reconstruction, America After the Civil War. He received 2 teaching awards from Harvard and was named a Walter Channing Cabot Fellow for achievements in scholarly eminence in the fields of literature, history, or art. In addition to his teaching, he is curating an exhibition on Frederick Douglass for the Smithsonian Museum's National Portrait Gallery in Washington, D.C., which is scheduled to open in June 2023. And he's also at work on a book on the abolitionist and civil rights leader, Charles Sumner. He lives in Cambridge with his wife, Deborah Cunningham, and their 2 sons, Eric and Nicholas. So John, we're absolutely delighted to have you here today to speak to us about reform through photography, and specifically Douglas's use of the visual image as well as an emancipatory mechanism and as a tool of progress. And I suppose maybe we could just open by noting that in your book, you identify Douglass as the most photographed American of the 19th century. And you've also identified and catalogued 160 photographs of him, perhaps even more now. But I wonder, could you open by telling us a little bit about how and why Douglass was so drawn to photography?
A number of reasons. One is Douglass was very critical of a lot of different kinds of art and art of him, especially drawings, and because he was familiar with the racist iconography, essentially the way of casting, of characterizing African Americans in racist terms, and there's a whole history of that. So one of the reasons why he believed photography was a crucial aid in reform is he recognized its truth value. And everyone knows today that you can airbrush out images, you can manipulate a photograph, but most people today still believe that a photograph that appears on the front page of the New York Times still has a certain truth value. And at that time, Americans had a love affair with photography that surpassed that of every other country, in part because they saw it as democratic. And it was also, for a variety of reasons, more accessible I can get into. But most Americans, and certain Douglas, believed that there was a truthfulness and accuracy for the photograph, so that a photograph would render him in the way that he wanted to present himself. And so I characterized the relationship between the photograph and Douglas and the photographer as a kind of pas de trois, a dance for three. And because of the exposure time from 1840s until really until through the 1880s, through most of Douglas's life, there was an art in sitting for the photograph. I mean, it required a sunny day for the 1840s and 50s. If it was cloudy and dark, you couldn't photograph. Almost all photography studios were on the top floor, and they had a skylight, so it required direct sunlight. And so one had to learn the art of posing and staying still and having the proper expression for 5, 10, 15, 20 seconds. And that's not easy. And Douglas, both in terms of his writings and in terms of what we know, he sought out certain photographers. In fact, he sat for African-American photographers, and African-Americans were a major presence in American photography. In fact, James P. Ball, this African-American photographer in Cincinnati, was hailed by Gleason's Pictorial at this time in 1850s, one of the leading art magazines, called James P. Ball, this Black photographer, the leading photographer in the country. Better than Southworth and Hawes, better than other people, if you're familiar with 19th century photography. And Douglas sat for him numerous times. So Douglas was drawn to photographers that he worked well with. And it really was a kind of team effort, and he very much saw it that way. There are other anecdotes. One of his friends, I mean, Douglas was famous. He was a household name soon after, certainly after he came back from England, Ireland, Scotland, following the success of his first narrative, his autobiography. And beginning in the late 1850s, people would describe how photographers would run after him, asking him to sit for them. So he had the pick of any photographer he wanted. I mean, by the eve of the Civil War, Douglas was one of the leading public intellectuals. I mean, an anecdote to highlight that is that Douglas could command a higher speaking fee than just about any other American, more than Emerson, who was widely seen as one of the great public intellectuals. And this was an age in which you made more money often as speakers, as a public speaker, as you did or than you did on your writings. The exceptions were, for example, women writers. Harriet Beecher Stowe was the best-selling writer in the 19th century in the United States, certainly for fiction. But women, it was a lot of white men in particular did not like women as public speakers. The one voice that women enjoyed in terms of disseminating their voice in the public was in the novel, was as writers. Douglas, as a man, could do it both as a speaker and as being photographed and as a writer. And in numerous instances, there are also examples of Douglas giving a speech. At the same time, he would offer for sale, or there'd be copies of previous speeches now in pamphlet form, and there would be photographs of him. So one of the early photographs of Douglas is, in fact, it's one of the early photographs of Douglas is, it was for sale to raise money by Southworth and Hawes, a very well-known Boston daguerreotype team, considered one of the great daguerreotypist photographers. And Josiah Hawes gifted it to the American Anti-Slavery Society to sell it to raise money. So that's a long answer, but I can summarize by saying that he believed in the truth value of photography. He believed it as part of the democratic nature, and he recognized that a photograph highlighted the essential humanity of all people. And he wrote a lot against these what's known as ethnologists, these so-called scientists who tried to argue that people of African descent were innately different. And in fact, polygenesis was a theory propagated by the scientist Agassiz, Louis Agassiz, who founded the Harvard School of Science, who argued that people of African descent were a separate species. And Douglas used the photograph to say, both in the image of the photograph and also in the desire that people have to represent themselves in the world. Douglas said that that all humans are fundamentally picture makers. They seek to make pictures of themselves in their world and to record that and to remember that. We're the only species that does that. And to this day, there are only a few other species who can recognize themselves in a mirror. So there is something that at that time Douglas and scientists considered it unique for humans to recognize themselves in a mirror or in a glass. Now there are a few other species, but not that many. So he highlighted the essential and equal humanity of everyone. And he also emphasized that one of the fundamental aspects of being human is this desire to have a voice and to disseminate it. And that can be disseminated in terms of words, in terms of images, and in terms of writing, in terms of music. One of my favorite lines from Douglas is from one of his speeches on photography, on visual art, where he says, poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. They make pictures. That's what unites them. Poets, prophets, and reformers are all picture makers. And that is the secret of their power. They see what ought to be in the reflection of what is and endeavor to remove the contradiction. So as picture makers, we see what is, we imagine and articulate a better society, a better self, and we seek to reform and improve that.
Oh, thanks, John. And I'm really interested in the way that you're sort of tying the act of picture making and photography and this dance between three as not just a form of picture making or photography, but perhaps of self-portraiture. And I wonder, is there a relationship that we can detect between, well, a very long project that you've described of photographing himself, having himself photographed, and engaging in this very particular and radical act of self-portraiture, and how we see the narratives? Or is there a relationship that we can see between these two things?
That's a very good question. Yeah, that's a wonderful question. So Douglas is best known as an autobiographer, as writing an I-narrative. And I've argued, and other scholars have too, that Douglas made a considerable contribution to autobiographical form. He expanded it in multiple ways that I'd be happy to get into. His first two, his narrative, and especially My Bondage and My Freedom, which was published in 1855, were immense selling, essentially bestsellers, especially My Bondage and My Freedom. My Bondage and My Freedom is also a deeply intellectual engagement with slavery, different forms of prejudice, and essentially what it is about being human. And he essentially makes a case throughout, or in that My Bondage and My Freedom, about the significance of the United States or any nation embracing not just the ideals of freedom and equality and equality under the law and in society, but why that's a fundamentally human aspect. So he is, in his time and to this day, very well known as an autobiographer. And I think you're absolutely right to think of his photographs also as an autobiographical act because of what I said. It's a great photograph in the 19th century, especially until the 1890s, stemmed from the subject participating in that act.
Yeah, thank you. It's an absolutely fascinating parallel, and the radicalism of the act that you've touched on, the act of portraiture and self-portraiture, became so important to anti-slavery activism and to Douglas's work in particular. I wonder, could you tell us a little bit about? I think you mentioned that those images were often public images, and I suppose maybe sometimes we think of photographs as private items, little mementos that we have of our lives and of ourselves. How was Douglas thinking of the photograph in relation to either his family or his public, or both, do you think?
That's a very great question. So of the 100, so the paperback, they're now, I've lost track. I think there are 100, close to 170 separate photographs. But of all the separate photographs of Douglas, there are less than a handful, really, of photographs of Douglas with his family. For Douglas, much as the autobiography, to write and publish an autobiography, it's a way of publicly disseminating the idea of oneself. And there's a function to it. Douglas wrote his autobiographies as a way to try to inspire people to become not just anti-slavery, but vigorous abolitionists. But because by telling his story of what slavery is and of the prejudices against African Americans and women, he was a major champion of women's rights. He hoped that the power of the words in his autobiography would convince people, would convert people to the cause of abolitionism and of women's rights. And the photographs function as the same way. So there are only a handful of photographs with his family. Almost all the photographs are designed to be disseminated publicly. I can share my screen and show you some examples. Hold on a second. So this, I can just briefly summarize. This is the first known photograph, and it coincides with Douglas becoming a public figure. So Douglas is discovered, so to speak, when he's a fugitive living in New Bedford, and he takes his first vacation. He goes to Nantucket to attend the American Anti-Slavery Society convention, is asked to speak, and the other abolitionists are amazed at his eloquence, and they hire him almost on the spot to become a public speaker. This coincides with the first image. And these earlier images are of the very young Douglas, where in my view, he's kind of searching for the proper pose. And he discovers it. He concludes that the right image for Douglas, the radical activist, is to stare his viewer directly in the face and confront the viewer. And essentially, it's a way of insisting upon equal rights and being treated as an equal citizen. And in a sense, in Douglas's, he always dressed up for his photo, in a sense, in the way he dressed, much like when he gave his speech, he would attend beforehand and try to make sure the lighting is correct. In the way he appeared, in the way he spoke, in the way he wrote, he was nothing if not obsessed with every word being the right word. He essentially, in the art of speaking, of writing, of having himself photographed, he sought to out-citizens white citizens at a time in which most Blacks weren't seen as not enjoying the rights of citizens or should not be accorded the rights of citizens. This is probably the best known photograph in Douglas's from 1850s through the 1870s. It's an engraving cut from a photograph, because an engraving is cut from a photograph, Douglas and most other people believed in its truth value. And artists would say that it's based on a photograph. And that was the frontispiece of My Bondage and My Freedom, his best-selling book. Here's another image of Douglas in 1863, again, staring the viewer down in the face. When he had a prop next to him, it usually had significance. Here it's a book, and he's dressed elegantly. So he's presenting himself as this elegant, radical intellectual who is insisting upon or demanding freedom and equality. Here's some of the few photographs of his family. This is his youngest daughter, Annie, who died in 1860. And she's about 5 years old or so at this time. This is not a great image, but it's the only known photograph of Douglas with his daughter. It's never circulated. This is a photograph of Douglas and his second wife, Helen Pitts. There are no photographs of Douglas and his first wife. There are no photographs, aside from Annie, of Douglas being photographed with his other children, which is significant. Here's another, I think, fascinating photograph of Helen Pitts and their honeymoon. The background, it gives you a sense of the photographer's studio. They do a visit Niagara Falls, but they're not sitting on rocks. This is a facade on the back of the studio. In fact, you can see the waves, like suddenly a stark divide between the waves and the rock. So it's clearly a backdrop rather than the real thing. Douglas's pose from 1840s and through the Civil War was that he would stare down the viewer, and then photo manuals would instruct photographers to pose men, particularly esteemed men, looking up or beyond or away from the camera lens in a kind of visionary gaze to highlight their statement, their leadership, their visionary aspect. After the Civil War, Douglas started to use this visionary gaze, and this is the one example where he's looking away. This is unusual, though, is that Douglas never, this is the only photograph of the 170 some photographs in which Douglas shows a smile, because for white racist artists, one of the caricatures is that of the happy black. And that was the last thing Douglas wanted to have disseminated in his photograph. And my view, one of the reasons he drops his guard and he allows himself to be photographed with a smile here is that a year before his death, he is one of literally the 3 or 4 most popular and influential Americans, white or black. In fact, when he dies in 1895, the Chicago Tribune, one of the nation's leading papers, and primarily a white paper, said that no one in the last 50 years has had as much influence in the United States as Frederick Douglass. And you know, and that was a white paper. There, in the last decade of his life, there are numerous anecdotes of Douglas giving a speech or just walking in down the street, and whites as well as black recognizing him, going up to him, asking for autograph. And it's part of the popularity of his photographs. At this time, Americans had photo albums, just like people have photo albums today. But in the 20th century, in most photo albums, they're photo albums of friends and families. In the 19th century, they'd have some friends and families, but they'd also include in their albums people they had never met, but they saw themselves aligned with. And so if you're an enterprising photographer, one way for you to make a lot of money is to invite Douglas to your studio, tell him you're photographing him for free, give him a bunch of carte de visites and other photographs, and you have the negative and you can sell the negative to everyone who walks in. And that was a big business, which is why photographers were fighting each other to have Douglas sit for them.
It's extraordinary that he recognized the significance of the new technologies so early. I mean, that first photograph that you showed from 1841, I mean, that must be just in the wake, really, of invention of the daguerreotype.
Yes.
And most of the photographs, correct me if I'm wrong, that you've shown us there, they're from the United States, and that's normal and to be expected. But I wonder if there's anything in particular about the United States that made it more open to image making of this kind, or more open to Douglas's entry into that kind of visual world in this way?
Yeah, that's a great question. So there are a number of reasons. One is that there's first a stark divide between the slave states and the free states. And the free states in the United States had a love affair with photography that was unsurpassed. And the slave states, one reason is because most Northerners saw themselves as artisans. The United States lagged Europe. It had not yet industrialized. You could count on less than 10 fingers the number of factories where people were wage laborers on any scale. So most Northerners were independent artisans who received the fruits of their own labor. And they believed in the democratic process of the daguerreotype. And if you were drawn to the visual arts at all, or drawn to mechanical instruments, you could make a good living as a photographer. And it didn't take that long. You didn't have to go to school. You didn't have to train with anyone. If you could read a manual and you had 3 months to 6 months to experiment with the chemicals, you've acquired a craft. And a lot of photographers, their studios were wagons. They just went from town to town, satisfying in the North the insatiable demand. And that was profoundly significant. Whereas the South, if the artisanal ideal was what drove the free states in the South, it was the planter slave owner ideal. Although 2/3 of white Southerners did not own slaves, the center of power and the center of culture in the South rested with the slave owners. And most the non-slave owning whites, their vision of the American dream was to acquire slaves and become a planter over their lifetime. And so photography contributed to this artisanal ideal, because it is then and now. It's an art, but it's also a craft. The photograph, unlike painting, it's a mechanical process. You need to be very rigorous in terms of mixing the chemicals, very rigorous in terms of knowing the lighting, but there's also an art in terms of the composition that you create. And so it fed into the love of the artisanal work. And women and men, there were, as I've already mentioned, numerous African-American photographers, because you didn't have to go to school, you didn't have to train with anyone. There were many female photographers. It was a truly democratic field.
Yeah, I mean, just looking through the run of them there, and the development of the image, and his arrival at that gaze, that sort of fugitive, direct gaze, is a very interesting one. And I was actually fascinated by that photograph that you showed from, I think it was 1863, which presumably is in the midst of the US Civil War.
Yes.
And this is obviously a very, very important time, not just for Douglas, but for the whole of the United States, North and South, enslaved and free, black and white. And I wonder, is there anything that we can say? I mean, he's looks exceptionally dashing, actually, in this photograph. And there's a slight military tone to it as well, as the intellectual tone that you noticed. But I'm wondering if his attitude, I'm inclined to think of the US Civil War also as kind of one of those wars that starts to appear in photography. And is there anything that we can say maybe about Douglas's thoughts about the photograph, his writing about the photograph, or how he used the image in this period that was either different or contiguous with what he had done before?
So Douglas first started, his first any kind of extended writings on photography were during the Civil War. He gave several talks beginning, it's the first time he gave a talk just focusing on photography or visual aesthetics. And he would preface these talks by saying, you might wonder why in the midst of this huge rebellion we're involved in, I'm talking about photography, I'm talking about aesthetics. And so he essentially connected that, this war is really, the war is about the status of blacks in American society. Should they be slaves or should they be free, and should they enjoy the rights of citizenship? Everyone knew that at the time. So Douglas said, to address this central question of the war is also to address the question of art and photography, because it's Douglas's argument in these talks was that the photograph, and in particular, is more than most other genres. It highlights the irrefutable notion that people of African descent are equal in their humanity and should thus deserve the same sort of equality. So it's much more of an intellectual speech than most of his political speeches. But I think it took great courage for him to make them during this war. So he connected it to the war. And it was also the war where he became, by the end of the Civil War, he was truly one of the leading figures. In fact, when Douglas met with and advised President Lincoln 3 times in the White House, and in their first meeting in August of 1863, Douglas went of his own accord because he had gripes with the laggardliness of Lincoln's anti-slavery vision, and in any event, Douglas, there's already a line of whites waiting to see Lincoln, and Douglas gets in line and he sends up his card, and when Lincoln finds out that Douglas is waiting for him, he calls Douglas up, and so he passes all these white men in line, and Lincoln begins the conversation. And we know this both from Douglas's account and from the visitor who met with Lincoln right after, because Lincoln was thrilled enough to say, "I just had an hour-long meeting with Douglas." And Lincoln first addressed Douglas by saying, "Hello, Mr. Douglas. It's very good to meet you. I know you've been critical of my slowness to turn this war into an abolition war. I know you've been critical in other ways. What can I do for you?" And they had this hour-long meeting. The second meeting, Lincoln invites Douglas to the White House because he wants Douglas's help in trying to win the war. It's in 1864. It's before Sherman takes Atlanta. The rise of Copperheads, meaning anti-war Northerners, has exploded. Lincoln and everyone else thinks he's going to lose election, and he hopes that Douglas might help him eke out a military victory and help him win the re-election, and Lincoln's first platform was the 13th Amendment that had to abolish slavery. So the war plays for Douglas, a crucial role in the photographs. I can show you another image. This is of the second inaugural. So I've circled Douglas. He has a front row seat. You can see the wall and the podium, and Lincoln is speaking. Douglas is, yards away from Lincoln, and after Lincoln's second inaugural, Douglas attends the reception in the White House. And Lincoln sees Douglas enter, and he raises his long arms. There's a crowd of whites around him, and he yells out, "Here comes my friend Frederick Douglass. It's good to see you. I saw you in the crowd today." And you can see how close they are. He says, "What did you think of my address? There's no man in these United States whose opinion I value more than yours." That's a quote. And we know that not only from Douglas's account, but there was a woman from Boston who was right next to Lincoln who kept a daily diary, and she said the same thing in her diary. So it's not something that's exaggerated or made up. But that highlights the degree to which Douglas is a major public figure in the war effort, as a speaker, as not any kind of formal politician, but certainly a crucial advisor to politicians.
Well, it's certainly quite a tribute there. Jana, I've got a question coming in from our audience here, and I wonder, would you mind if I put it to you? It's a question from Bruce, and he asks, Do you detect any differences in the photographs of Douglas in terms of pose and demeanor before he secures his freedom? And maybe we could even ask that same question as you're talking about the Civil War, around the Civil War as well.
That's a very good question. So when he first, so one of the things I should say is that Douglas, one of the characteristics, and I've been using the term voice, one of the defining aspects of slavery is that I call it a totalitarian state. In a slave society, it's crucial to deny any kind of voice for slaves, because if they're able to disseminate their voice about what slavery actually is, it's not going to survive. And in every slave society in the US and ancient and classical antiquity, the voice of slaves are denied. They're denied to learn to read or write. And that was true in the United States. So Douglas, as a slave, recognizes the power of his voice. And once he acquires that as a fugitive and starts speaking publicly, that coincides precisely when he starts having himself photographed. So he literally saw the power of his voice and the power of his image, and having them disseminated, both functioning and serving as a crucial aid in ending slavery and racism. And they went hand in hand. And initially, the early photographs I can show you, he's kind of searching for a pose. He's kind of a vision. He's looking in the visionary gaze. In a sense, he's posing in the way that the photographer, the photo manual instructs him to pose, not staring down the viewer. That was unusual at the time. And here's another beautiful photograph, but he's a contemplative pose. And he's clearly experimenting, just like as a writer, he would experiment. He would experiment both in terms of his rhetoric and the way in which he delivered speeches, the way in which he would write. Just as any great artist does. And then he felt that staring the viewer down was the most effective way. And so and this also coincides at the time in which he is no longer a fugitive, but legally free. When he comes back from England, Ireland, and Scotland after going there, because his first autobiography is so successful, and it's a tell-all. He names who his masters are. And one of his masters, Hugh All, in the Baltimore newspaper, publishes an article saying that he is going to go to any length possible to recapture Douglas. So Douglas flees to Ireland, England, and Scotland just for his safety. And the Brits and the Irish raise money to give him legal freedom. They buy his freedom from his joint masters, Hugh and Thomas Auld. And now when he comes back, he's legally free. But even before, well, that's a good question. His signature pose of staring the viewer down really begins when he is legally free, having returned from England, Ireland, and Scotland. I should say that, as I did, that the United States, one of the cultural differences is that photography flourished far more than in the United States than it did in England, Ireland, and Scotland. For a strange reason, the Brits, the photography took hold primarily among the aristocrats. So Julie Margaret Cameron is a brilliant, great photographer, but the photographers who were known were almost all aristocrats, and most of the subjects were. It was also more expensive. The particular style or format of photography in England was more expensive. It didn't have the mass appeal that it did in the United States. I think partly because people were so spread out, and families were split up because sons and daughters went elsewhere to search for a better life or to try to make more money. Right? Most of the artisanal work in the North was family farms, and understandably, a lot of young men didn't want to just toil on the farm with their father. They were ambitious. They wanted to see the world. Hence the drive for photography.
Oh, thanks, John. It's really fascinating. And if you don't mind, I'm just going to put we're getting in questions thinking
Okay.
fast
Sure.
from your listeners, and I wonder if you would mind if I put them to you.
Sure.
There is one here from someone whose name I'm afraid I can't quite make out, but they wonder if Douglas was ever photographed by the famous Matthew Brady.
Yes.
And there's another question which maybe you might want to take with that, which is around the circulation of Douglas's image in the southern United States. And would Douglas have seen, or would Southerners have seen these images, or would they have been censored?
Very good question. So the second image, or the answer to the second question, is that no, Douglas's images did not circulate in the southern states before the war. They did not. The only instances of photographers who are well known, like the photographer who photographed these slaves for Louis Agassiz, they were in cities. They were in cities, and the other factor in the South is that because of the master class in the South, the planter, they saw themselves as traditional aristocrats in a European sense. So if you succeeded in the South, the last thing you wanted to be was a craftsperson or an artisan. And in fact, the South, it was the slaves who were the artisans. The slaves built the homes, the slaves did the pottery. It was not socially dignified for a white person to aspire to be an artisan or craftsperson in the way it was in the North. What was this? The aspiration in the South is to acquire enough slaves so you could just manage them and not have to actually work with your hands. Whereas in the North, that artisanal ideal was the central ideal. Southerners also recognized the threat of photography and of images to the institution of slavery. John C. Calhoun, when he was senator, after the masthead of William Lloyd Garrison's Liberator appeared, which is of a slave being whipped at a whipping post right in front of the US Capitol, John C. Calhoun was so upset that he tried to pass a federal law banning the circulation of any image that could be construed as anti-slavery. Another example of the way in which the southern states were truly totalitarian, every southern post office systematically, once a month or every 3 months, they went through the mail, and any letter or image that was construed to be anti-slavery was ritually burned. There was most communities had lists of banned books because they threatened the institution of slavery. So they did not circulate at all in the South. In terms of major photographers, yeah, I can, if it's okay, I can stop screen sharing, open up another screen and just give you a brief sense of, or open up another file and give you a brief sense of the degree to which Douglas was photographed by all of the major photographers. Just give me 1 second. You can go on with another question.
Yeah, well, we've got several in. There's a question here from Fionnghuala Sweeney, who asks about Douglas's photography and how we might think about it in relation to other people who were circulating their own image at this time, and in particular Sojourner Truth. So is there any evidence that Douglas sought to control the commercial possibilities of his image in the way that Sojourner Truth did?
Yes, that's a wonderful connection between Sojourner Truth. Sojourner Truth was, like Douglas, immensely drawn to the power of photography. So was Harriet Tubman. And both of them sat for their photograph, understood the political and cultural significance of their photograph. Sojourner Truth, like Douglas, presented herself as in a radical way. She presented herself as a middle-class matron. Essentially, both Sojourner Truth and Douglas presented themselves as American citizen. In one photograph of Truth, which I can share also, it might take me 30 seconds or so to find it. Truth is sitting, as it appears to be a middle-class matron. She has a sewing needle, and if you actually look closely at the thread follows the contours of the eastern United States. So you can see Florida, and then you can see Texas, and then it disappears. And the meaning of that is that Sojourner Truth is sending a message that she is a representative American woman, that she deserves to enjoy the same rights of freedom and equality that any other woman or man should enjoy. And Douglas does the same thing with his image and with his words.
Well, it's kind of it's a nice connection as well, because Douglas was very much a man of the written word, as well as the photograph, whereas both the Sojourner Truth and Tubman were not people who dealt with the written word very deliberately in both their cases.
Yes.
So it's interesting that they found common ground, I suppose, in the visual image.
Yes. So here's an image, Matthew Brady, carte de visite of Frederick Douglass. This is a photograph by James P. Ball, the Cincinnati black photographer, who is called the leading photographer by Gleason's Pictorial. Douglas also sat for black photographers, a large number. Here's James Hiram Easton from a black photographer. Here's Phineas Headley and James Green, an interracial photography team based in New Bedford. And here's Cornelius Batty, another African-American photographer. He also sat for women, Lydia Cadwell. He got to know well. Lydia Cadwell was one of I think, a brilliant photographer based in Chicago. So that gives you an example of, he was truly democratic in who he sat for, as long as the photographer could render him in a way that he thought would create a appropriate image. And again, it's important to emphasize the degree he saw the photograph as a kind of team effort. It was as I said, a pas de trois. It was this joint effort between the camera and the chemicals and the photographer and Douglas.
John, you've done extraordinary work in putting together a catalogue raisonné of Douglas's work, his photographs. And I know that there have been some photographs that have emerged more recently. Could you tell us anything about those? And just, I suppose, a final question then, is there anything you'd love to find? Is there any photograph that you really hope is out there that we can uncover or unearth?
So I would love to discover, I mean, I understand why it might not occur, but there's no known photograph of Douglas and his first wife, Anna Murray. I mean, she was in part responsible for him becoming free. I mean, she was born free. She was a free black woman, worked as a domestic. Douglas met her when he, as a slave, was sent back to Baltimore. So in a sense, he married up. It was in large part owing to Anna Murray that he was able to escape. It was his money that Douglas used to take the train to escape. It was his money that he used to purchase a uniform so that he could pass as a free black sailor. Her money that he used to show identification as a free black sailor. And when he started on the lecture circuit, I mean, she managed the home. She raised the children and managed the home. There's not a single photograph of them together. And I would love to, so my first wish list would be a photograph of Douglas and Anna.
Well, yeah, that would be really something, I think.
Yeah, it really would.
John, I could listen forever, but we are unfortunately coming close to the end of our time. Okay. I wonder if there's anything that you'd like to say just to finish about any images that we might have that are significant in an Irish context.
Yeah.
Or not, and then
yeah. I will share some. So I prepared these. These are two. This is actually new to the paper graph. I mean, so I mentioned that Douglas, so one of these images was in the hardcover, but it was in the archive of the New York Historical Society and was mislabeled. It was mislabeled as coming from somewhere in the United States. And we discovered this second photograph. These are two photographs from Ardkill, Killiney County in Dublin, Ireland. And you can tell that it's the same photo session. Douglas is looking somewhat the same. And again, he's staring the viewer down. Different women beside him, they're friends in Ireland. Douglas had a lifelong epistolary friendship with many Irish friends in particular, but then went back with Helen, his second wife. They spent a year traveling through England, Ireland, Europe, going to Egypt and other places. So that's one Irish connection. This is 1887. And Douglas appears, I believe at this day, I don't think it's been torn down, but in Belfast, Northern Ireland, there is an anti-racism mural from that was created in 2011. And I've been there, and you see this mural from a large, it's accessible and visible from many different parts of the city. It's in a big hill. I think it's a magnificent mural based on this photograph by Matthew Brady. And there's also a similar version of it, and by Dan Devaney in New Bedford, Massachusetts, where Douglas got his start after he escaped from slavery. So those are the two photographic connections to Ireland.
Thanks, John, and thank you for that wonderfully rich and provocative and informative talk. I will pass it to, well, first our thanks, and I will pass you over to Caroline now to say our formal goodbyes.
Okay, can I just end with one brief note or one sentence? So, I mean, what we didn't really discuss is how these 19th century photographs continued to have an afterlife in the 20th century. The Irish or the Belfast mural is one. Douglas's image continues to circulate in the United States. It's a kind of afterlife. And in one sense, I think it's because activists, especially Black activists, but radical activists, they've looked to Douglas, and they, much like today, especially in Black Lives Matter, they take advantage of media and technology in quest of achieving civil rights and human rights today, in much the same way Douglas did. And so they borrow from Douglas. I mean, there's a long tradition of activists borrowing from the past, learning from the past. And so Douglas inspires activists throughout the 20th century. They protest against lynching and segregation. They lobby for civil rights and celebrate Black power. And so in one sense, the largest sense, Douglas helped to launch one of the major battles in American cultural history. It's a battle between racist stereotypes and the idea that could be realized of democracy. And across 50 years of photographs, and through the circulation of his image, he fought for civil rights and human rights in his time, and his successors, who are inspired by using, if not the specific Douglas image, but inspired by his image to continue the fight with imagery today. That fight is ongoing. Most people affiliated with Black Lives Matter, especially African Americans, the anecdote is, many African Americans won't leave home without the camera, without their cell phone. Because if something happens, people today still believe in the truth value. The George Floyd murder and the video that came from it is what sparked, according to the New York Times, the largest protest movements in American history.
It's quite a legacy, quite a legacy.
Frederick Douglass continues to inspire us. Thank you so much, Professor John Stauffer, Dr. Fionnghuala Sweeney. Thank you
No,
so
thank
much.
you very
It's been so impressive and so insightful. I can't believe there's always more photos coming out, and they're always so fantastic. And it's just fascinating to hear all the stories. And John, you did just marvelous. Thank you so much for sharing with us. Fionnghuala, thank you so much for sharing. And we invite you to all of the other Douglas Week events to celebrate this great man who keeps inspiring us through all the media, all the genres, and in so many ways. And just thank you so much, everyone. Thank you, John. Thank you, Fionnghuala. Kristen, happy Douglas Week, everyone. Thank you so much. Have a good night.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.